She tapped the glass lightly with her dessert spoon and waited for the room to quiet down. And I remember thinking she looked beautiful. She always knew how to hold a room. 41 people at the Lakeshore Grill in Detroit on a Friday night in October, my retirement dinner, the one my colleague Dennis had organized. And Diane was standing up with a legal envelope in her hand and a smile. I had only ever seen her use on strangers. She was trying to charm. Then my son Marcus started clapping. He clapped before she finished her first sentence. He clapped like he was at a Red Wings game. I set my fork down. The steak was good, I remember that, which is a strange thing to remember. My wife was handing me a legal envelope, and my son was clapping, and my daughter Kira had her phone angled in a way I recognized from all the times I'd caught her filming at family dinners. Not recording, streaming. I am 64 years old. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer for a firm in Detroit's New Center district. I designed load-bearing structures. I signed off on foundation depths. I was the man who stayed on a job site in February in the kind of cold that gets into your back and stays because the specs had to be right the first time. I built things that are still standing. I will probably be gone before some of them need their first major repair. I did not cry at that table. I did not yell. I looked at Diane, really looked at her, and I said quietly enough that only she could hear, "You have no idea what you just started." She laughed. She thought I was the same man I'd been for 34 years, the man who absorbed everything and kept writing the checks. She was wrong. But I want to tell you something important before I tell you what happened next, because this story only makes sense if you understand where I came from. My father, James Hallbrook, was a machinist from a small town in rural Georgia who came to Detroit in 1961 with a trade certificate and $40 and a belief. Not faith, belief, which is a harder thing that you could build something permanent if you were willing to do the actual work without anyone watching. He worked the floor of a manufacturing plant on the east side for 31 years. He never drove a new car. He never took a vacation that required a flight. When he died, he left me a structure, not money, not a house, a structure. A set of legal and financial documents he'd spent the last decade of his life quietly building with a trust attorney in Southfield. I spent 15 years adding to it while Diane was renovating our kitchen in Grosse Pointe for the third time, and Marcus was burning through the money I gave him for business ideas that arrived in confident PowerPoint presentations and dissolved before their second year of operation. I want to be honest with you about something. I don't share this part easily. I had known for 8 years that my marriage was over. Not in the way people mean when they say a marriage is over, meaning the feeling is gone. I mean, I had looked clearly at the mechanics of what Diane and I had built together, and I understood with the same flat, factual clarity I brought to a structural survey that the weight distribution was wrong, that I was carrying load that had been promised to be shared and wasn't. I had spoken to a trust attorney in Birmingham, Michigan. Her name was Patricia, and she had written her law school thesis on family trust architecture, and she charged accordingly, and she was worth every dollar. Together, we formalized what my father had started. The family trust held the house. The trust held certain investment assets. I was the sole trustee, and the permitted occupancy clause was written with a specific contingency. If I ever filed for divorce, or if a divorce petition was filed against me, the permitted occupancy dissolved. That clause had taken Patricia and me 3 sessions to write. We wanted it airtight. We wanted it to be the kind of thing that, if you challenged it in court, you had to come prepared. Diane had signed the occupancy agreement in 2016 on a Saturday afternoon between a phone call about holiday travel and an argument about whose turn it was to pick up the dry cleaning. She had her own attorney present, a man she'd used for a real estate transaction who reviewed every page and signed the certificate of independent legal advice. She had chosen not to read carefully. That was not the trust's problem. I called my accountant, Sandra, from the parking lot of the Lakeshore Grill while Diane was still inside accepting hugs from her friends. The night air off the Detroit River had that particular bite it gets in October, the kind that makes your eyes water if you stand still. Sandra picked up on the second ring. She did it, I said. A pause. Are you all right? Activate everything, I said. Tonight. Another pause, shorter. I'll have it done before morning. I drove to my brother Frank's house in Ferndale. He had the spare room ready. He'd known this was coming for 2 months because I had told him. Because Frank has never once in his life treated me like a source of income. I sat in his kitchen and drank a glass of water and watched the clock on his stove move from 10:47 to 11:23 and felt, beneath the grief, and there was genuine grief. I want to be clear about that. A feeling I hadn't felt in years, clarity. By 9:00 the next morning, the supplementary credit card Diane had been using for 11 years on my account was canceled. By 10:00, the leased Volvo she drove, registered under my firm's fleet account, had been flagged for return. By noon, she tried to use the card at a Whole Foods on Courchevel Avenue in Grosse Pointe and was declined in front of 4 women she knew from her yoga class. She called me 6 times before lunch. I let them go to voicemail. The first voicemail was confused. The second was irritated. The third was the voice she used when she thought you still manage me. The last one ended with her saying, "Whatever point you're trying to make, Raymond, it isn't worth this." I listened to all of them once, standing in Frank's backyard with a cup of coffee, and then I put my phone in my shirt pocket and stood there a while longer, watching a pair of starlings fight over the edge of Frank's bird bath. It wasn't a point. That was the thing she never understood about me. I don't make points. I engineer solutions. Marcus showed up at Frank's house that afternoon. He didn't knock. He walked around the side gate like he still had a right to any space I occupied. He stood in the back garden with his hands in his pockets and told me I was being dramatic. He told me that his mother just needed her independence, that this was a healthy thing, that the mature response was to sit down with the mediator she had retained and work out a fair split. I looked at my son. He is 32 years old. In those 32 years, I had paid for his university twice because he switched programs halfway through the first time. I had covered the down payment on his condo in Midtown. I had funded 3 business ventures that he presented to me with the polished certainty of someone who had never experienced a consequence, and that each collapsed inside of 18 months. The last one, a logistics startup he insisted was going to change how produce moved through the city, had dissolved 4 months ago without ever filing a tax return. He was telling me to be mature. I told him I appreciated him coming by. I told him I'd handle things in my own way. I told him the tea was getting cold and I'd like to finish it. He left. He was furious. On the way out, he kicked the side gate hard enough to rattle it. A cedar gate I'd installed myself 3 years ago, still level, still solid. Some things hold. That's the whole point. What Diane did not know, what none of them knew, was that she had never actually owned the house in Grosse Pointe, not legally, not in the way she'd assumed for 8 years. The trust had held it since 2016. The mortgage had been paid off by the trust in 2022. Diane had been a permitted occupant of a trust-owned property. The permission had just expired. He called me that night in a register I had never heard from her before. Not her charming voice, not her managing voice, something lower, something that sounded almost frightened. "Raymond," she said, "tell me the house isn't real." "Which part would you like me to explain?" I said. "The trust, the house." "The trust has owned the house since 2016, I said. "The title registration is in the package Patricia sent to your attorney." Silence. "Where am I supposed to go?" "You have 60 days, I said. "Patricia will send the formal notice tomorrow. You're welcome to take your personal belongings." Most of the furniture was purchased through the trust account. She started to say something, then she stopped. "You stood up in front of 41 people, I said. "You chose the venue, you chose the timing. You brought a lawyer's envelope to my retirement dinner and handed it to me like I was a problem you'd finally solved." I paused. "I want you to understand that I'm not angry. I'm just done absorbing." I hung up. I want to pause here for a moment because I know how this sounds from the outside. I know people hear trust structure and callable advances, and they picture a cold man calculating revenge in a quiet room. That isn't what I was. What I felt in Frank's spare bedroom that night, staring at the ceiling at 2:00 in the morning, was not triumph. It was grief. Genuine, exhausting grief. For 34 years. For the version of this marriage I had wanted it to be and had stopped admitting wasn't real somewhere around year 12. If you have ever loved someone for so long that the love became structural, load-bearing, invisible, the thing the whole building rested on, and then discovered that the building had been treating you like the foundation treats the ground, then you know the particular quiet of that kind of loss. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in. Kira called an hour after Diane. She had been crying genuinely, I think, not performing. She told me what I was doing was cruel. She told me her mother was 60 years old and couldn't start over. She told me I had always cared more about structures and money and control than about my own family. That landed somewhere. Not because it was true, but because I had heard of it for so long, the husband who worked too much, the father who drove a 15-year-old truck, the man who read the accounts on Sunday mornings like they were scripture, that I had half believed it myself. I had spent years carrying that characterization around like it was the accurate version of me. I asked Kira when she had last paid her own rent without my help. She hung up. The court date was 9 weeks later. Diane had retained a well-regarded family law attorney named Alderman and a co-counsel who was frankly better. They arrived prepared. They came in with language about financial control and economic abuse, and 34 years of domestic contribution and reasonable expectations under Michigan's marital property statutes. Patricia let them finish. Then she opened her first binder. I want you to understand what that room felt like. It was a Thursday morning in late November, the kind of gray that parks over Detroit like it owns the place. The courtroom was not dramatic fluorescent lights, wood paneling, a judge named Harmon who had the expression of someone who had seen every version of this story at least 40 times. Patricia walked her through the trust structure methodically. She explained my father's original intent. She produced the 2016 trust registration, the 2022 mortgage satisfaction, the permitted occupancy agreement, and the certificate of independent legal advice. Diane had signed with her own attorney present. Alderman argued she hadn't understood the implications. Patricia produced the ILA certificate. Diane's attorney had reviewed every page. Diane had chosen not to engage carefully with a document that governed the roof over her head. The judge's expression did not change. Then Patricia placed a second binder on the table, 12 years of financial records, every transfer I had made to Marcus's accounts, every month of Kira's rent subsidy, every cosign loan, every business venture I had bankrolled. Patricia read the total into the record the way a physician reads a blood pressure number without drama, without editorializing, with simple factual authority. $418,000. The room got very quiet. Honestly, if that had been my wife sitting across the table and I heard that number read aloud, I don't know if I could have kept my face still. I don't know if I could have stayed in my chair, because it wasn't just money. It was 23 years of Sunday afternoon transfers and co-signed documents and phone calls that started with Marcus saying, "Dad, I have an idea," and ended with me sitting at my kitchen table writing down a number I already knew I would never see returned. $418,000 isn't an accounting figure. It's a life's worth of choosing to believe in people who had stopped giving me a reason to. Patricia read it without blinking. That's why I hired her. Alderman tried to argue the transfers were ordinary marital spending. Patricia directed the court to the trust deed, which classified all discretionary transfers to non-primary beneficiaries as callable advances against future distributions. Diane had not been moving family money. She had been drawing down against an account that didn't belong to her. Judge Harmon looked at the binders for a long time. She denied the motion to freeze my personal accounts. She denied the emergency support order. She looked at Alderman over her reading glasses and suggested, in a tone that carried the weight of someone who had eaten overconfident attorneys for lunch before, that if he intended to challenge the trust structure, he was going to need considerably more than a reasonable expectations argument, and she recommended he take the weekend. We walked out of the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice into that gray November afternoon. Patricia was quiet until we reached the parking structure, and then she said, "That went about as well as it could." I nodded. "She's going to try again," Patricia said. "I know," I said. "Lit here." Marcus made one more attempt. He came to Frank's house on a Saturday morning. Quiet this time, not the furious boy who'd kicked the gate, but something more measured, more considered. He sat across from me at Frank's kitchen table and told me he'd been doing some thinking. He said the construction work he'd picked up laboring because the Midtown condo project had fallen through and the logistics startup had dissolved, had given him some perspective. He said he understood now that he'd taken things for granted. He said he missed his father. I looked at him for a long time. There is a version of that conversation that ends with me forgiving everything on the spot. I know that version. It is emotionally satisfying in the short term. The way a collapsed structure is dramatic in the short term, but I am a structural engineer. A foundation does not fix itself because the building above it has become uncomfortable. You have to go down to the problem. You have to do the actual work. I told Marcus I believed he was sincere. I also told him that sincerity without change is a feeling, not a fact, and feelings don't load test. He asked what that meant. I told him I had spoken to a site foreman at a civil construction company in Hamtramck, a man named Gerald who I'd worked alongside for 12 years, who knew Marcus's situation and had agreed to offer him a position, not as a favor to me, as a trial. Entry-level survey assistant. Early starts, outdoor work in Michigan weather, union scale, no seniority until he earned it. Marcus stared at me. "You want me to be a laborer? I want you to learn what a day of real work costs," I said. "In your body, in your time, I did it. Your grandfather did it for 30 years. It doesn't diminish you. It's the only thing that's ever actually built anyone." He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands. I noticed, and something shifted in me. When I noticed that his hands already had the early calluses of the labor work he'd been doing on his own. He hadn't been sitting still. He'd been out there already getting his hands into the work without knowing whether it would mean anything to me. That mattered. He said he'd think about it. He took the job 2 weeks later. Kira was a harder conversation because she had inherited her mother's ability to position herself at the center of any wound. Every time I tried to speak with her, the conversation migrated back to how the situation had affected her, how the uncertainty was damaging her mental health, how her followers, she had a lifestyle account on Instagram with about 9,000 people watching her post pictures of her apartment and her meals, and her opinions about things were her community, and she couldn't just pivot. I waited. 6 months into the separation, her lease renewal came due. The $1,200 a month I had been contributing to her rent in the Corktown neighborhood of Detroit was already listed in Patricia's financial records. An alderman had quietly recommended to Kira through Diane's attorney that she secure independent housing before the settlement finalized. The subsidy stopped in March. In April, she moved into a shared house near Wayne State with 2 roommates. In May, she got a job at a design agency doing production work. Not the creative direction she'd imagined for herself, but production, deliverables, deadlines. The kind of work that doesn't care about your aesthetic vision, only whether the files are right and on time. In June, she called me on a Sunday afternoon, not to fight. She said, "Dad, I want to understand what you built. Can you explain how the trust actually works?" I explained it. She listened for almost an hour. She asked good questions, not the questions of someone looking for a loophole, but the questions of someone encountering a serious structure for the first time and trying to understand why it was built the way it was. Before she hung up, she said, "Grandpa would have been proud of it." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "That was exactly the point." Diane settled in January, not what aldermen had come in asking for, not close. Trust held. The house transferred back to full trust control. She received her share of the joint marital investment account, which was substantial enough that she was not left with nothing, and Patricia had been clear with me from the beginning that the goal was never destruction. We negotiated a fixed-term support arrangement tied to her employment status. Diane had a real estate license she'd let lapse in 2019. She renewed it. Last I heard, she had closed 4 listings in the spring market. I don't wish her ill. That surprises people when I say it, but the anger I'd been carrying, the particular bone-deep exhaustion of a man who gave everything and not all at once. Slowly, the way fog burns off the river when the sun finally decides to commit. What was left underneath wasn't bitterness. It was just a very long, very clear road. I am living in a small house near the Huron River now, west of the city, bought in my own name from trust distributions I've been taking since retirement. There is a workshop behind the house where I am building a cedar strip canoe. It takes a long time to do properly. The strips have to be fitted one by one, each one bent to the curve, each one glued and clamped and allowed to set completely before you move to the next. You cannot rush it. I have the time. A woman named Elaine, who I met at a lecture at the Detroit Institute of Arts, walks with me in the mornings along the river path. She teaches ceramics at a community studio in Ypsilanti. She has her own small house, her own students, her own strong opinions about things that have nothing to do with what the neighbors think or what the market is doing. She does not require managing. She is the best conversationalist I have met in 30 years. My shoulders have not been tight since November. Gerald called me after Marcus's 3-month review. He didn't have to, but he did. He told me Marcus had showed up every day on time without complaint and that he had a good eye for the grade work. He said he was thinking about recommending him for a survey technician course in the fall. I called Marcus that evening. We talked for nearly an hour about the work, about a drainage problem he'd figured out on a site in Sterling Heights, about the way the ground changes character from 100 yards to the next if you know how to read it. He talked about the work the way I used to talk about the work, with that specific animation that comes from having solved something real with your own hands and your own mind. Before he hung up, he said, "Dad, I get it now. Why you were always the way you were. I get it." I told him I knew he did. Kira came out in July with her 2 roommates. We walked a trail along the Huron and had dinner on the back deck. She brought a bottle of Michigan Dry Rosé and a book about the history of American civil infrastructure that she had marked up with color-coded post-it notes, yellow for things she didn't understand, pink for things she wanted to ask me about, green for things she said reminded her of me. There were a lot of green ones. I had to excuse myself for a few minutes after she handed it to me. I walked out to the workshop and stood in the dark for a while and looked at the ribs of the canoe in progress and let myself feel the full weight of what it means when someone finally sees you, not the version of you they needed, not the version they resented, but the actual, original person. My father built the first version of something real. He built it with machinist's hands and a machinist's mind, and a determination to leave his children something that couldn't be dismantled by people who hadn't earned it. I added the architecture. My children, if they earn the right to be named as beneficiaries, which they will have to do through demonstrated judgment and not through blood alone, will have access to something designed to outlast all of us. That is what Diane never understood. She thought the structure was a cage. She thought the careful, methodical way I had organized our financial life was proof that I valued control over connection. She stood up at my retirement dinner and handed me that envelope and smiled with all her teeth and thought she was finally getting free. But she had been free for years. Free to spend herself down to the margin of a life that looked independent but wasn't. Free to trade the substance of a built thing for the appearance of escape. What she handed me that night wasn't a threat. It was a release. I walked out of the Lakeshore Grill into the cold Detroit night and stood in the parking lot and looked up at the sky. You can still find the stars if you know where to look, even in this city. And I thought about my father. I thought about the $40 he arrived with. I thought about 31 years of early mornings on a factory floor. I thought about the conversation we had when he was dying, when he took my hand and said in that flat, quiet way he had of saying the most important things, "Don't let them take the structure, Ray. The structure is the only thing that outlasts you." I understood him then, finally, completely. I got in my truck. I drove to Frank's house in Ferndale. I made tea, and I let everything that came next unfold exactly the way I had built it to. Here's what I to leave you with, because this story has been sitting with me for a while, and I think it's worth saying directly. For a long time, the man in this story, Raymond, confused providing with building. He thought that absorbing pain was a form of strength. He thought that financing his son's dreams and covering his daughter's rent and staying quiet while his wife treated him like an inconvenience were the acts of a good man. They were the acts of a man who had confused load-bearing with love. Any engineer will tell you what happens to a structure that takes on weight indefinitely without anyone checking the connections. It doesn't collapse dramatically. It degrades quietly in the places nobody thinks to look. And then one evening at a dinner that was supposed to celebrate everything you built, the whole thing comes down. The mistake most people make is thinking that consequences are the same as cruelty. They are not. Cruelty is about making someone feel pain for your sake. Consequences are about restoring the honest relationship between actions and outcomes. A relationship that Raymond had been absorbing the gap on personally for decades. When he stopped absorbing it, the gap had to close on its own. That is not punishment, that is honesty. Here is the question I want to leave you with, and I mean this genuinely. Is there someone in your life right now for whom you are carrying load that belongs to them? Not because they asked you to, but because it became easier than watching the structure strain. If the answer is yes, that's worth sitting with. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think Raymond handled things exactly right. Drop a 2 if you think he went too far with the house. Drop a 3 if you'd have done something completely different. I want to know what you think, genuinely, because this one has gotten under my skin. And tell me, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I always find it something when I hear back from people in Detroit, in places like Ferndale and Hamtramck and the East Side. But honestly, this story lands everywhere that people have spent years holding something up that nobody bothered to notice. If you have ever been the load-bearing wall, the one who made sure everything stayed standing while the people inside the structure drove through without asking what was holding them up, then you already know everything Raymond knew. You just might not have had the chance to act on it yet. If this story reached you tonight, hit subscribe. I'm going to keep telling stories like this one, the ones that don't have clean heroes, that don't resolve the way films resolve, but that tell the truth about what it costs to build a life and what it takes to protect it. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Detroit, Michigan to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.